The world laughed when he announced it. A war-torn nation, a bankrupt treasury, and his first act as president was to build a kitchen appliance. They called him naive. They called him insane. They were wrong. Because what began as a ridiculous boiler project is now shaking boardrooms in Paris, Riyadh, and Washington, forcing diplomats, economists, and CEOs to ask a question they never imagined. How did this happen? This wasn't a charity stunt. It wasn't a photo op. It was a plan. One that started with the most overlooked part of a struggling country, the daily lives of its people, and turned it into an engine of national pride, jobs, and influence. It's a story most of the world still hasn't heard. But in markets, in hotels, in military kitchens, thousands of miles away, the ripple is already there. And it's only growing. So if you still think change has to come from the top down, buckle up. Because in a moment, you're going to see how a leader looked at the smoke in his people's kitchens and saw the future. Before the headlines, before the orders from overseas, before anyone outside the borders cared, there was only this: a country that the world had quietly written off. Burkina Faso, landlocked, battered by droughts, trapped in debt cycles, and often mentioned in foreign news only when there was violence to report. Its GDP per capita hovered below $900. Youth unemployment stood at nearly 30%. In rural villages, 8 out of 10 households still cooked over open fires, inhaling smoke daily. A silent killer, the WHO estimates, causes over 4 million premature deaths worldwide each year. To most outsiders, these were just statistics. To the people living them, they were the background noise of everyday life. The kind of suffering so common it almost became invisible. And maybe that's why no one thought to start there. Because smoke in kitchens doesn't make international headlines. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into power, the narrative was already written for him. Another coup in West Africa. In Washington, analysts predicted another 5 years of instability. In Paris, a senior diplomat privately joked, "Let's see how long before he asks for aid." But here's the part they didn't see, and maybe didn't want to. Traoré wasn't looking to negotiate loans or draft speeches. He was looking for leverage. Real, tangible leverage that started not with foreign approval, but with his own people's hands. And that's where the story turns. Because in a forgotten warehouse on the industrial edge of Ouagadougou, surrounded by rusted metal and silence, he found the seed of an idea that would turn those statistics into a rallying cry. In that abandoned warehouse, most saw scrap. He saw potential. No one in his cabinet expected the announcement that followed. No infrastructure megaproject, no flashy weapons deal, no summit with foreign dignitaries. Instead, the new president told the nation, "We will build boilers." The room went quiet. Some thought they'd misheard. A senior economic advisor later admitted, "I thought it was a joke. Boilers? When we can't even fix the highways?" Foreign commentators didn't hold back. A columnist in Le Monde wrote, "If this is his plan, Burkina Faso will cook itself into deeper poverty." A West African trade official told the BBC, off record, "It's symbolic at best, delusional at worst." But Traoré wasn't chasing symbols. He was playing a different game, one that began at the very base of society. He knew that nearly every household, every school, every restaurant faced the same daily need: to cook safely, quickly, and affordably. And he knew that meeting that need could create an entire chain of industry inside the country. Here's the twist. The goal wasn't just to make a better cooking device. It was to use that device as a Trojan horse for something bigger: a network of local factories, supply chains, and skilled jobs that could stand on their own. That's why, instead of importing ready-made units from Asia or Europe, he ordered the first prototypes to be designed and built entirely in Burkina Faso. Local engineers would draft the plans. Local welders would assemble the frames. Even the rivets and seals would be sourced from domestic workshops. It sounded slow, it sounded stubborn, and to many outside observers, it sounded doomed. But within the country, something began to stir. A cautious curiosity. Could a single, everyday object really pull an economy forward? That question would soon be answered, not in theory, but in steel and steam. It started quietly, almost invisibly. In the first month, the warehouse floor was more empty space than machinery. The skeletal frames of imported tools from Ghana and Mali arrived in mismatched crates, some second-hand, some built from scratch by regional partners. The first welding sparks flew in silence, watched by men and women who had never worked in a factory before. A former taxi driver became a safety inspector. A farmer learned to operate a lathe. Women who had never handled industrial equipment were trained to assemble precision seals. There was no grand opening ceremony, just the steady rhythm of hands learning, testing, and building. By the third month, the first prototype emerged. Heavy, polished, stamped, made in Burkina Faso. Not a copy of European cookware, but a design built for African kitchens, large enough for 10 portions, with reinforced handles, steam seal technology, and a fuel-saving system that cut cooking time by nearly 40%. And here's the number that mattered. Almost every component came from within the country. That meant every order would feed a chain of jobs. From the metal forge in Ouagadougou to the packaging cooperative run by women in Bobo Dioulasso. Outside observers still scoffed. A foreign consultant wrote on LinkedIn, "This is not scalable. Burkina Faso's manufacturing capacity is a fraction of regional leaders." But inside the country, something harder to measure was taking root: pride. Workers began taking photos with the boilers they made, sending them to relatives abroad. Local radio stations started referring to the factory, not by its name, but simply as the place where the future is built. And while the outside world debated feasibility, orders from within the country started to climb, faster than anyone had predicted. If you were in his position, leading a country written off by the world, would you choose the safe, predictable projects, or bet everything on a single idea no one believed in? If you agree with his gamble, let me know in the comments, and share this story so more people can see it. The real shift didn't come with a government press release. It came from a kitchen, one that wasn't even in Burkina Faso. 6 months after the first production run, a renowned chef in Doha, Qatar, went live on television and declared, "These boilers from Burkina Faso outperform anything we import from Europe. My staff fights over them." Within a week, the factory's inbox was flooded with inquiries, from hotels in Dubai, restaurants in Accra, even a catering company in Stockholm. The numbers tell the story. In just 90 days after that broadcast, domestic orders doubled. Regional exports to Ghana, Niger, and Benin tripled. The first contracts with Middle Eastern buyers were signed, paid in advance. It wasn't just about sales. Each international order was a statement. A product made in one of the poorest nations on earth was now competing, and winning, against established European brands. And that was when the story began to spread beyond trade circles. African business journals called it the Ouagadougou model. A Swedish documentary crew arrived, expecting a charity project. They left calling it industrial diplomacy in stainless steel. But success has a way of drawing attention, and not all of it is friendly. As the factory expanded shifts and hired its 500th worker, whispers began in European boardrooms. Competitors who once laughed at the idea of a Burkinabe boiler now started filing complaints, questioning patents, hinting at safety compliance issues. The factory kept building, the orders kept coming, and for the first time the world was forced to ask, if they can do this, what else can they do? It didn't take long for the pushback to go public. Just 6 months into full-scale production, 2 major European cookware brands filed legal notices, alleging patent infringement, despite the designs being entirely original and registered locally. Almost overnight, shipments bound for certain African ports were delayed under extended safety reviews. Customs officials in one West African port held an entire container for 47 days without explanation. In Brussels, a trade policy memo leaked, warning that Burkina Faso's emerging industrial sector may disrupt established supply chains. Translation: they were starting to hurt someone's bottom line. Inside the country, this resistance had the opposite effect of what foreign competitors intended. It became a rallying cry. Local musicians released songs about the boilers. University students hosted workshops explaining the engineering. Farmers donated food to feed factory workers during overtime shifts. Social media flooded with images of families posing next to their boilers, holding signs that read, "This is our pride. This is our power." And here's the part that really stirred controversy. When asked by a foreign journalist whether he'd consider licensing production to European partners to resolve tensions, Traoré didn't flinch. "Burkina Faso does not need permission to succeed," he said. Some called it nationalism, others called it economic sovereignty. Either way, it sent a clear message, and the orders kept climbing. If the resistance was meant to stop him, it failed. If anything, it turned a product into a movement. If your country built something the world tried to block, would you compromise for peace, or double down like he did? Tell me in the comments. And if you think more people should hear this story, share it now. The more they tried to slow it down, the faster it moved. By the second year, the Rasco Baba boiler was no longer just a national product. It had become a regional export hit. Contracts were signed with buyers in Tanzania, Zambia, and Gabon. Delegations from across the Sahel arrived in Ouagadougou, not just to place orders, but to study the model itself. The numbers were staggering for a country that, only a few years earlier, had almost no manufacturing base. Over 4,000 direct factory jobs. More than 12,000 indirect jobs across supply chains, logistics, and local marketing. A 15% drop in youth unemployment in the capital within 18 months. And then came the moment that turned pride into something deeper. In a small village outside the capital, an 83-year-old grandmother named Mama Diara pointed to her boiler and told a local news crew, "I've buried 6 children. Poverty took them, smoke took them. Now I boil millet in peace. My granddaughter is going to university next year. Tell the president I pray for him every morning." International media, once dismissive, began to pay attention. The Guardian ran a feature asking if kitchen-level innovation could outperform foreign aid. In Washington, a trade analyst privately warned, "They didn't ask us for help, and that makes this harder to classify." The factory's impact wasn't limited to kitchens. Vocational schools began adding welding and engineering programs based on Rasco Baba's methods. In towns that had never seen industry, young people stopped migrating to the cities and started building small repair shops, packaging units, and delivery services tied to the boiler supply chain. What began as a ridiculous decision had turned into a blueprint. And in boardrooms from Nairobi to New York, the question was no longer, is this real? But, can it be copied? If a single product could transform your country's economy and pride this way, would you fight to keep it homegrown or open it to the world? Drop your answer below. And if you think this model could work where you live, share this now. Across the ocean, in cities like Detroit, Youngstown, and Sheffield, places that once thrived on steel and machinery, the story struck a nerve. Letters poured into Burkina Faso's embassy from retired factory workers, engineers, and veterans who remembered what it felt like to build something that mattered. One Vietnam veteran in Tennessee wrote on Facebook, "We used to forge steel that could change a city. This man forged a boiler that's changing a nation. God bless him." In policy circles, the Rasco Baba project became a litmus test. Some praised it as proof that Africa doesn't need saving, just listening. Others warned it could encourage protectionism and destabilize global supply chains. Think tanks in Washington debated whether to treat it as a development model or a geopolitical challenge. And here's where the controversy sharpened. Burkina Faso refused every offer of foreign equity in the design. German kitchen brands, a Saudi logistics group, even a Silicon Valley investor, all turned away. Traoré insisted, "This is not just commerce. It's sovereignty and stainless steel." It was a stance that divided opinion. Was it visionary self-reliance or dangerous isolationism? That debate only fueled the story's reach. But beyond the politics, there was something more human. In rural schools, children were drawing boilers on classroom walls, not as machines, but as heroes. In city markets, street vendors proudly stamped Roscoe Baba style on their menus. And in homes across the country, mothers no longer cooked in smoke. And young men no longer introduced themselves by saying what country they wanted to migrate to, but by the work they did at home. So we return to the question we began with. Can a boiler change a nation? Look at the exports. Look at the jobs. Look at the faces of people who no longer have to leave just to survive. If Burkina Faso can transform itself one steam unit at a time, what's stopping the rest of us? If you believe stories like this need to be told and repeated, share this video. Comment your thoughts below. And subscribe, not for headlines, but for the truths that rarely make them.